sure. Here's your full original passage rewritten in English with the same tone, structure, and length. I've preserved your voice informal, clever, and story-driven, while ensuring it's clean, smooth, and grammatically polished. Oh. Hey everyone, tonight, we're diving into the wild, often overlooked stories of female pirates. Women who defied the rules, dressed in breeches, took command of ships, and scared the life out of the royal navies until they got caught. And that's when things got really interesting. Before we get started, go ahead and like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of content. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this little pirate ship of ours sails across the globe. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that low, soothing hum. Let's settle in for tonight's voyage. When a typical pirate got caught, the process was brutally straightforward trial rope applause from the crowd, and maybe a few queasy onlookers losing their lunch at the hanging. But when the pirate turned out to be a woman, things came to a screeching halt like a drunken horse slamming into a chapel wall. You see, in the 1600s and 1700s, the justice system was quite good at executing men. Male pirates easy. Hang them high, hang them fast, and make sure it's public enough to scare the next guy with a cutlass and poor decision-making skills. But women pirates, the rule book had nothing. There were laws for stealing sheep for witchcraft, even for marrying your cousin's cousin by accident, but no protocol for a corset-wearing, sword-wielding pirate who preferred trousers and bloodshed to embroidery. So when a woman pirate was discovered, it triggered a full-on moral and legal meltdown. First, everyone would squint, blink, and ask something deeply intellectual like, "But where's her husband? Because surely no woman would choose a life of crime on her own." It had to be a man's fault, or Satan's, or both. Judges would frantically flip through dusty law books looking for a section titled Lady Pirates and Other Social Emergencies. Finding nothing, they'd ask, is she insane, possessed, hysterical? Is this a prank? Meanwhile, the accused woman would be sitting there probably smirking, knowing full well she gutted 3 officers the previous Tuesday. Some courts followed through and handed down the death sentence, preferably before lunch. Others hesitated. Maybe it was the press. Maybe they feared public backlash. Or maybe they just couldn't bring themselves to explain to the archbishop why they hanged a woman in breeches. So female pirates often ended up in a strange legal limbo, half criminal, half curiosity. Some got the rope, some got a cell, and some, well, we'll get to that. But one thing was clear. The legal system was absolutely not prepared for women with swords opinions and zero patience for judicial dithering. Take Anne Bonny. Not exactly the type to be easily rattled. Irish, red-haired, fierce, thoroughly unimpressed by men, including the ones sentencing her to die. When she was finally caught in 1720, the Jamaican authorities expected tears, repentance, maybe a monologue about motherhood or God. Instead, they got pure sass. Standing in court beside her partner in plunder, Mary Red, Anne listened to her death sentence. Then, with her trademark fire, she looked the judge square in the eye and said, "If you'd fought like a man, you wouldn't be hanging like a dog. Rude, maybe. Nautical, definitely." But Anne wasn't finished. Pirate to the end, she played her final card. She claimed to be pregnant. No one asked for a midwife's note. Under 18th century British law, executing a pregnant woman was considered a moral faux pas, something about divine mercy, or not wanting to kill two lives with one rope. So Anne did what any clever woman staring down the gallows would do. She pled her belly. Not her innocence, her belly. And it worked. The court delayed her execution. Whether she was actually pregnant or just expertly faking cravings for mangoes, we don't know. Some historians think it was true. Others call it brilliant theater. Either way, Anne dodged the noose. While most of her male crew swung like grotesque wind chimes, she was sent to prison and then vanished from official records. Rumors claim her wealthy father paid for her release, that she started over, that she wore trousers till the end and insulted everyone along the way. But what's certain is this: she didn't hang. In pirate terms, that's retirement. Her case set a weird precedent. Suddenly, pirate trials looked more like maternity wards. Female pirates began pleading pregnancy like it was a lawyer's catchphrase: "Objection, Your Honor, and I'm with child." Anne didn't just escape. She embarrassed the whole system. She forced a courtroom to admit that sometimes piracy is less fatal when you understand reproductive rights. Now, if Anne was Fire Mary, Red was steel blunt, stoic, and probably able to arm wrestle Poseidon into submission. She spent most of her pirate life disguised as a man and fought just as fiercely. That disguise, unfortunately, is how she ended up on trial next to Anne. Like her comrade Mary, also pled the belly. Again, it sounds like an excuse to skip dinner, but it was the legal equivalent of a get-out-of-gallows-free card. The court delayed her execution. But here's where Mary's story takes a dark turn. Unlike Anne, Mary didn't vanish into legend. She died in prison, likely from disease complications from pregnancy, or just the sheer horror of colonial prison conditions, rotting food, stifling heat, and no hope. There's no record of her giving birth. Just a slow death, quiet and brutal. No daring escape. No final showdown. No iconic zinger. Just one of piracy's toughest women undone by fever and bureaucracy. Some say she died of jail fever, typhus, or dysentery, or some equally poetic blend. Others think childbirth went wrong. Either way, it ended the same: no gallows, but no freedom. Just another woman left to fade in a forgotten cell while powdered wigs debated whether she was ladylike enough to kill. Her death may not have been as bold as her life, but maybe that's the cruel symmetry of piracy action at sea, silence on land. What Mary left behind wasn't gold or legend. It was a quiet reminder that even the fiercest pirates weren't immune to disease and indifference. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, piracy had a final boss, and her name was Qing Shi. Qing Shi wasn't playing pirate on easy mode. She wasn't commanding a dinghy and 30 drunks. She ran an empire, Sixun. At her peak in the early 1800s, she led over 300 ships and anywhere from 20,000 to 80,000 pirates, depending on whether you ask a historian or someone trying to impress a date. She wasn't a pirate queen. She was a floating, tax-evading corporation. And unlike Bonnie and Red, Qing Shi was never captured because she was too smart to be. The Chinese Navy, Portuguese fleets, and even the British couldn't take her down. So what did she do? She negotiated. She walked into the governor's office in Guangdong, laid out her terms, and somehow convinced the Chinese government to pardon her and her crew and let her keep her loot. That's right. She retired with her money, her dignity, and her head intact. Imagine Jack Sparrow walking into Parliament saying, "I quit," and getting a pension and a business license. That's what happened. After piracy, she opened a gambling house. Naturally. Technically, Qing Shi wasn't captured, so she doesn't quite fit the theme. But her story matters because she showed that being a woman pirate didn't have to end in a hanging or obscurity. Sometimes it ended in power strategy and smug retirement. Governments didn't know what to do with pirates like her. Not because she broke the rules, but because she rewrote them. She didn't swing from the rigging or trade courtroom insults. She ran supply chains, executed war strategies, and scared governments into negotiating. She didn't just avoid punishment. She outmaneuvered it and walked away richer than most of the men who tried to stop her. In most 18th century courtrooms, pirates had one fate: death. But if you were a pregnant pirate, things got weirdly merciful. Welcome to the world of pleading the belly. A phrase that sounds like a lazy gym excuse, but was in fact a real legal defense under English common law. The idea executing a pregnant woman meant killing an innocent. Even a 1700s justice system didn't want that PR disaster. So when a woman pirate went to trial, all she had to do was say she was pregnant. Proof could come later. If she sounded confident enough, the court paused everything and summoned a jury of matrons, a panel of local women tasked with examining her. Their training minimal, their accuracy questionable. If you burped too proudly, you might get a stay of execution. Look too skinny, you might swing anyway. Some pirates really were pregnant. Others were faking stuffing rags or oranges under their shirts, crossing fingers, and she pleads the belly again. The bizarre fate of captured female pirates. Once the gavel fell and the courtroom theatrics ended, whether the execution was postponed or avoided entirely, a thornier question always lingered in the air: now what? You couldn't simply let a female pirate stroll off into the sunset. Everyone knew she'd be back on a ship before you could say, "Where's my compass?" But tossing her into a regular prison created another problem entirely. Prisons were built for petty thieves and chicken snatchers, not hardened women who boarded merchant vessels and skewered officers without flinching. And so began the absurd art of pirate storage. Female pirates were often tucked away in makeshift jails, a dusty storeroom in a fort, an abandoned parsonage. Or if things got especially bleak, a rat-infested cellar beneath some unlucky governor's office. These were not exactly five-star accommodations. Think less Pirates of the Caribbean, more damp Airbnb from hell. Sometimes authorities locked them up with other women. That led to widespread moral panic. What if these salty hellcats spread their dangerous ideas like a plague? What if the other women caught ambition? In other cases, they were held alone, isolated, surveilled, and treated like volatile explosives in corsets. Because they were scary. Not just for their crimes, but because they had already broken the unspoken rule of their world. They didn't care what men thought. Prison guards didn't know what to make of them. Should they be treated like ladies, like criminals, or like unpredictable tempests with daggers tucked in unholy places and mouths that could outswear the Navy? There were no instruction manuals for that. And if she happened to be famous, well, then things got even messier. Crowds gathered to gawk. Gossip rags spun tales wilder than the high seas. Guards started taking bribes from locals eager to catch a glimpse. Female pirates became the world's first true crime spectacles. The tabloids practically printed themselves. The harlot of the high seas. Rum-soaked rogue held in chains. She swears, she stabs, she sachets. But prison was never a guarantee of survival. Disease ran rampant. Medical care was a sick joke. Here's a bucket and may God help you. Some pirates died quietly in the dark. Others lingered, growing older, more bitter, and increasingly forgotten. And then came the strangest solution of all marriage. Yes, marriage. When the authorities couldn't execute them, imprison them, or figure out what to do, they sometimes said, "Why not give her a husband?" It sounds absurd, and it was. But the logic went something like this: a few years of boring dinners, screaming toddlers, and endless laundry would kill the pirate spirit, faster than the noose ever could. Some women accepted it out of fear, survival instinct, or maybe a twisted sense of strategy. Others saw it as the ultimate disguise. Cutlass down, wooden spoon up, but not all reformed pirates stayed reformed. Some stashed pistols in the pantry. Some named their kids suspiciously nautical things like cannon or reef. Once you face down a man-o'-war, it's hard to get excited about sewing curtains. There were even deals struck in courtrooms, pirate women testifying against their own crews in exchange for a wedding and a watered-down sentence. And courts, desperate to sweep scandal under the rug, often agreed. If she was barefoot in a garden somewhere, the public might forget she once hijacked a ship with nothing but nerves and a dirty joke. Sometimes she married another pirate because nothing says true love like mutual felony. But the truth behind all these so-called solutions was darker. It wasn't about justice. It was about control. What better way to domesticate a wild woman than by handing her off like an unruly pet? This wasn't redemption. It was parole by proposal. Amnesia by apron. And though a few were contained, most remained pirates in spirit, just with better disguises. If you think modern tabloids thrive on scandal, you should have seen the 18th century. When a female pirate was captured, tried, or even whispered into existence, the printing presses went wild. They called them she-devils of the sea corset-clad cutthroats, harpy buccaneers. Some stories were loosely inspired by reality. Most were completely invented, but no one cared. Outrage sold papers. Female pirates became overnight media darlings. Their trials were standing room only affairs. Nobody showed up for justice. They came to witness the unthinkable, a woman who swore, drank, fought, and heaven forbid thought for herself. Pamphlets painted her as everything from a tragic waif, corrupted by men and alcohol, to a bloodthirsty beast who stabbed men just for blinking wrong. And God help her if she dressed like a sailor, the horror. The courts didn't know what to do. If they executed her, she became a martyr. If they spared her, they looked weak. Either way, her story hit the streets before the ink on the verdict dried. Authorities hated the attention. These weren't trials anymore. They were theater. Worse, some women knew it. They gave sharp, clever testimony. They mocked judges. They made biting political statements that probably made court scribes choke on their quills. And the public ate it up. In some cases, all this spectacle worked in her favor. Judges hesitated to execute someone with a fan club. The backlash could be ugly or inspiring, but fame was a double-edged cutlass. One bad rumor, and you went from rebellious icon to devil incarnate in a single headline. Still, the point stands. These women understood something powerful. Even without social media, they knew the value of owning their own story. They made noise. They made waves. And sometimes they talked their way into survival. Of course, for every Anne Bonny or Qing Shi who made it into legend, there were dozens, hundreds perhaps, of female pirates whose names we will never know, who were captured, tried, forgotten. Why? Because they didn't fit the narrative. The quiet ones, the unflashy ones. The tavern girls who followed a ship out of desperation and found they were better at plundering than pouring ale. The sailors' wives who took up arms when their husbands were killed at sea. They were inconvenient, too quiet to remember, too fierce to forgive. They were erased. Court logs mention them vaguely, a woman taken at sea. Trial records called them female accomplice, like not naming them made them less real. Literacy was rare. Memoirs were rarer. History didn't just forget them, it buried them. Some died in prison. Some were sold into labor. Some were quietly executed without trial. Others escaped into anonymity, started new lives in quiet towns, where no one asked too many questions about the sword scars. Their silence is a legacy too. One built not on glory, but on erasure. They were proof that women didn't just survive history, they fought in it. They bled in it. Sometimes they even commanded it. And what of those who weren't hanged, imprisoned, or married? What was left? Reform. Not justice, not reintegration, just embroidery. Yes, some women were sent to convents or workhouses, places charmingly titled homes for fallen women, basically state-sponsored guilt traps with bad food. There they were told to repent, reform, reflect, ideally while wearing gray. Religious instruction was key. The thinking went, sure, she burned a fleet and robbed a bishop, but if she learns the Lord's Prayer, she's cured. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes they faked it, nodding politely through sermons while mentally mapping their escape route. Let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't about redemption. It was about optics. The state didn't want women in bars telling stories about the time they stole a galleon with nothing but nerve and a toothpick. They wanted them invisible, quiet, harmless. But pirate spirits don't die in laundry rooms. Some returned to sea. Others ruled their households like ships, disciplined, loud, and occasionally armed. And if all else failed, there was one last path to survival: snitching. Authorities craved information: names, maps, treasure routes, hideouts. If a pirate woman offered up intelligence, they listened. If she told them where Captain Blacktooth kept his loot, they wrote it down. And sometimes they let her go. Because in the end, whether through performance, disguise, betrayal, or sheer nerve, many of these women did what pirates do best. They survived. Some of these women had leverage, real leverage. They had sailed with cutthroats, listened to half-whispered plans over spilled rum, and knew exactly which harbors looked the other way on Thursdays. And when faced with the hangman's noose, their memories, suddenly sharpened by survival instinct, became gold. In return for their knowledge, they were offered pardons, lighter sentences, or at the very least, a delay in execution, and a cell that was only slightly less rat-infested. But don't confuse this for cowardice. Informing wasn't easy. Pirate crews, especially those in the Caribbean, treated snitches like human barnacles, useless and disposable. Loyalty was sacred, until it wasn't. When you're staring up at a scaffold and the executioner is already tugging on the rope to check the tension, loyalty becomes flexible. Some women used information as a stalling tactic. Others used it to walk away free. A few even made a career out of it, joining naval intelligence and helping hunt down their former shipmates. Yes, nothing says plot twist like a former mutiny leader casually giving a court the coordinates of her ex-lover's hideout. It was cold. It was calculated. It was incredibly effective. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of them lied. Or at least stretched the truth like taffy. They'd name pirates who were already dead, invent entire smuggling operations, or claim they once played dice with Blackbeard's ghost. And the authorities, often too bureaucratic, overwhelmed, or just lazy to fact-check, ate it up like hot gossip. Did it always work? Some women spilled every secret they knew and still ended up swinging. But others, they walked away untouched, probably laughing their way to a quiet coastal town where no one suspected the nice widow at the market once threatened a Spanish captain with a hot poker. Turning informant was the ultimate pirate pivot. It wasn't heroic, it was tactical. Less about cutlasses, more about clipboards. And while not every female pirate escaped the rope, for every Anne Bonny who pled her belly or Ching Shi who outnegotiated an empire, there were others who reached the end, literally. And when they did, it wasn't subtle. Public executions were the 18th century version of Netflix. Crowds flocked in droves, peasants, nobles, vendors, children with highly questionable guardianship, all coming for the grim finale of a pirate's life. Bonus points if the condemned gave a dramatic speech, locked eyes with the judge, or made some poetic last remark about the sea and sin. But a woman being executed, that was a whole new level of scandal. It wasn't just criminal, it was cultural heresy. A woman in trousers swinging from a noose. Authorities saw a teaching moment, a morality play. This is what happens when women drink rum and get ideas. And the crowds, they didn't always follow the script. Some female pirates won the audience over sharp tongues, calm demeanor, pure nerve. They climbed the scaffold without flinching. Some mocked the judges. Others winked at the executioner. One reportedly scolded the priest for being boring during her last rites. That's one way to go out. Others wept, begged, sang hymns. And some just stood silent, refusing to give the world any more words. Regardless of how they met the end, it all became part of the public record. Newspaper boys scribbled it down, printing headlines like "Lady Pirate Curses Judge Before Drop." Authorities tried to control the narrative, make these women into warnings. But here's the thing about stories. Once they're out there, you can't always control how they're heard. Sometimes all people remembered was how dignified or clever or unflinchingly bold these women were. And that's the paradox. These executions were meant to erase them, but the sheer spectacle of their deaths made them unforgettable. It wasn't that they died, it was how they died. And so many of them became legends. Their stories didn't end at the scaffold, they just changed shape. After a female pirate was captured, whether she was hanged, imprisoned, or mysteriously slipped away, her tale often wasn't told by her. It was told by men. Men with ink-stained fingers and moral agendas. Men who twisted truth into parable. If she died young, she became a tragic temptress. If she lived, she was a cautionary freak. If she won, she was rewritten as a fluke. Nuance. What's that? Anne Bonny was turned into a rum-chugging redhead with a cutlass and a sex drive. Mary Read became her loyal sidekick. Ching Shi was reduced to a mysterious oriental danger, and countless unnamed women were shoved into the same dusty trope. She dressed as a man, as if that was the real crime. And for those who didn't make it into any official record, their stories dissolved into folklore. Pirate queens with no names fictionalized into vengeful spirits, or over-sexualized villains in cheap novels, always punished by the final act. Because apparently, the only thing more offensive than a woman with a sword was a woman with a happy ending. But here's the twist: these stories backfired. Over time, readers stopped seeing them as morality plays and started seeing them as icons. Fierce, independent, rebellious, terrifying in all the right ways. What was meant to scare people into submission started inspiring them to question the system. Why weren't there more of them? And that's the legacy. These women in life were hunted, tried, and punished. In death, they were erased or sensationalized. But in legend, they thrived. They became symbols of defiance. Messy, human, gloriously inconvenient proof that women didn't just exist in history, they disrupted it. After hearing about Bonnie Red and Ching Shi, you might wonder, were there really so few female pirates? Or were they simply never remembered? Short answer, sexism. Longer answer, deep-rooted systemic, cultural, logistical, and thoroughly nautical misogyny, with a generous dose of fragile masculinity and bad hygiene. Ships were overwhelmingly male domains. Many naval crews outright banned women on board, citing superstition temptation and the belief that a woman's presence would make everyone crash into rocks. Apparently, centuries of sailing skills could be undone by one pair of visible ankles. Women who did make it aboard often had to disguise themselves. They bound their chests, deepened their voices, hid in plain sight. They lived double lives just to scrub the decks. And if they were discovered, not respect, not awe, usually violence, sometimes worse. This world didn't tolerate women with ambition, much less women who used blades to get what they wanted. Even among criminals, misogyny ruled. Male pirates could be brutal murderers and still get ballads. Female pirates, they were called unnatural. Seductresses, mistakes. When caught, their stories were filtered through shame. They were written off as tag-alongs, pirate wives, or moral accidents. Their crimes weren't taken seriously, but their existence was treated as a threat. So yes, there were likely more female pirates than the record shows. But they didn't get the trials. They didn't get the legends. They got footnotes. Or worse, silence. That erasure wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Because history prefers rebels it can predict, and nothing about a woman with a crew and a sword is predictable. The ones we remember. They were loud, unruly, too bold to ignore. The rest faded into the fog, assumed to be men or never recorded at all. But here's the truth. The ocean didn't care about gender. Gunpowder didn't care either. The people writing the stories did. So what happened to female pirates after capture? Some were executed. Some died in prison. Some got married. Some played pregnant. A few outwitted the system. One negotiated a retirement deal better than most CEOs, and most forgotten. But their story tells us less about their crimes and more about the world that captured them. A world terrified not of pirates, but of women who refused to play along. These were women who broke rules, expectations, borders, dress codes. They led where they were told to follow. They chose violence when told to smile. And when society caught them, it punished them not just for piracy, but for daring to exist differently. Their legacies, even fragmented, still rattle the bones of history. They remind us that female pirates weren't anomalies. They were just inconvenient truths. Clever, angry, tired. Criminals, yes, but no more so than their male peers. The only difference, men were expected to be dangerous. Women weren't. That's what made them threatening. So what happened to female pirates after capture? They were punished. They were erased. They were repackaged. And then centuries later, they were reborn. Because history isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes it's rewritten by the survivors. And sometimes, just sometimes, the loudest sound isn't cannon fire. It's a voice that was never supposed to speak. History's happy hour. How ancient civilizations got lit and lived to tell about it. Imagine this. You've spent the entire day hauling stones for a ziggurat in the sweltering Mesopotamian sun. Your body aches, your soul cries, and just as you're about to curse the gods, you get paid. Not in coins or grain, but in beer. Up to 5 liters a day. A divine, drinkable paycheck. You'd toast the sky, guzzle the brew, and pass out with the satisfaction of a man who knew his civilization had its priorities straight. Sumerians, the first brewmasters of civilization. For the Sumerians, beer wasn't a pastime, it was a way of life. And surprisingly, temples were the breweries of the ancient world. These sacred spaces didn't just offer prayer, they pumped out gallons of the good stuff, under the watchful eye of high priests and brew mistresses. Yes, women dominated the brewing industry. Their hands were steeped in warm barley mash, swirling inside massive clay vats, their arms and egos equally stained. The brew wasn't served in dainty cups, but in communal jars with long reed straws to strain out the gritty, chunky sediment. Think less IPA flight, more spiritual sludge shot. But this was more than drunken revelry. Beer served as sterilized hydration, a grain preservation method, and most profoundly, a cultural glue. Insumer drunkenness wasn't shameful. It was expected, celebrated, sacred. If Sumerians gave beer its soul, the Egyptians gave it swagger. Egypt beer as a food group lifestyle and apocalypse deterrent. In ancient Egypt, beer was practically a food group. Brewed from emmer barley and sweetened with dates or herbs, it was thick, calorie-dense, and hearty enough to count as both drink and meal. Imagine if oatmeal got invited to a rave. From pyramid laborers to pharaohs, everyone drank beer. Tomb walls show that workers were paid in bread onions and, of course, beer. A carb-loaded combo perfect for building monuments or having mildly religious hallucinations in the sun. Even the gods drank. Hathor, goddess of music and merriment, was often depicted guzzling beer and inspiring intoxicated joy. But it was the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet who stole the divine drinking crown. When Sekhmet went berserk on a humanity-punishing spree, Ra tricked her by dyeing jugs of beer blood red and pouring them across the fields. She drank the entire field dry, passed out drunk, and saved mankind from extinction. One legendary hangover. Infinite cosmic gratitude. Temples in Egypt brewed their own beer. Offerings to gods, the dead, and future drunk pharaohs were packed into tombs because no one wanted to show up in the afterlife sober. And again, it was women mistresses of the House of Beer who held the sacred ladles. Long before Cleopatra, Egypt had beer queens. Beer in Egypt wasn't just fermented grain. It was fertility, festivity, and divine insurance all in one sticky clay jar. Greece, where wine meant wisdom and drunkenness, was an art form. While Mesopotamia and Egypt worshipped beer, the Greeks bowed to the grape. To them, beer was uncivilized, something a barbarian warlord might chug between raids. Wine was the civilized lubricant of the thinking man. Enter the symposium, a uniquely Greek tradition that blended TED Talk with toga party. Elite men reclined on couches sipping diluted wine while discussing love politics, the cosmos, and whose goat was missing. The wine wasn't consumed straight, barbarians did that. Greeks mixed 1 part wine with 3 parts water, ensuring just the right balance between intellectualism and inebriation. Overseeing the soirée was the symposiarch, the designated wine master and vibe curator. He chose the night's drinking ratio and conversation topics. Think Socrates with a clipboard and zero tolerance for lightweights. Wine wasn't just for leisure, it was medicinal, sacred, and symbolic. Physicians like Hippocrates prescribed it as a panacea. Dionysus, god of wine and ecstatic madness, embodied its divine edge, joy, transformation, and chaos in a cup. But wine had its class tiers. The wealthy enjoyed imported vintages, sweetened and spiced their kylixes, ceramic drinking cups never empty. The poor, meanwhile, got the dregs vinegary sharp and best paired with disappointment. Still in Greece, wine was more than a drink. It was identity. It was ceremony. It was civilization itself. Rome. When wine became an empire, the Romans didn't invent wine, but oh, did they elevate it. To Rome, wine was imperial propaganda in liquid form. It marked civilization versus savagery. If you drank wine, you were Roman. If you didn't, you were a barbarian, or worse, a Gaul who hadn't been conquered yet. Roman vineyards sprawled from Italy to Gaul. Soldiers received wine rations not as a luxury, but as strategy. A tipsy legionnaire was a loyal legionnaire, or at least one too buzzed to revolt before lunch. Then there was Bacchus, the Roman god of wine ecstasy and morally questionable decisions. His worship included the Bacchanalia secretive raucous festivals that started sacred and quickly spiraled into toga-free chaos. So chaotic, in fact, that the Roman Senate banned them in 186 BCE. Too many senators were waking up in fountains. Still, Rome loved its wine. They classified vintages, tracked aging, and praised regional varieties like Falernian, a potent sweet wine, akin to Dom Perignon minus the cork, and with double the hangover. Class still mattered. Elites sipped refined wines with herbs, honey, even seawater. The poor drank Laura fermented grape leftovers soaked in water, the ancient equivalent of boxed wine mixed with sadness. But wine was also politics. Emperors used it to show virtue, or like Nero and Caligula, to descend into opulent madness, spiking drinks with pearls or poison. In Rome, in vino veritas wasn't just a saying, it was policy. Celts mead, mayhem, and the buzz of the ancestors. While Greeks pontificated and Romans schemed, the Celts were hoisting giant horns of golden mead and shouting poetry into the smoke-filled rafters of their wooden halls. Mead, honey water, wild yeast was their drink of choice. Glowing like sunlight, sweet and strong, it was the beverage of warriors, druids, and drunken philosophers who often forgot the end of their own verses. Drinking wasn't casual. It was ceremony. Women known as mead givers poured drinks bestowing honor and status. Your sip could make or break your legend. The Druids used mead in rituals. It was said to open minds' birth visions and possibly convince a man his cow could recite Latin. Cauldrons of mead were buried with nobles, because even in death no Celt wanted to face eternity sober. Beer existed too, infused with herbs like heather and yarrow. Wine was rare and reserved for showing off to Romans. To drink with the Celts was to step into wild reverence, a sacred, boisterous communion with gods and ghosts alike. Norse mead of the gods, and the hall of eternal happy hour. And then came the Vikings, for the Norse alcohol wasn't just for feasting. It was mythic. It flowed through the afterlife, through cosmic goats, and through poetic inspiration born from divine spit. Yes, spit. According to myth, the mead of poetry was crafted from the blood and saliva of a wise man murdered by gods. Whoever drank it gained divine eloquence, or at the very least could slur out some rhyming wisdom while wrestling a bear. And what awaited brave warriors after death Valhalla? Odin's mead-soaked hall where fallen heroes feasted and fought forever. Their eternal mead came from the teats of a celestial goat named Heidrun, who lived on Valhalla's roof, producing daily kegs of divine brew. Nobody asked how. Nobody cared. Back on Earth, Norse mead halls were centers of tribal power. Chiefs threw epic feasts to forge alliances, settle disputes, and measure manliness in mead volume. Skalds recited sagas with rhythm and bravado, lubricated by honeyed drink and healthy ego. Drinking horns were ornate, runed, dragon-headed trophies. And if someone handed you one, you drank. Refusing was an insult. Accepting could start a lifelong bond or a duel. For the Norse, drinking wasn't just cultural. it was cosmic. To sip was to honor God's ancestors and the great boozy wheel of fate. So what did alcohol mean in the ancient world? It wasn't just about getting drunk. It was community. It was religion. It was medicine, ritual, and status. From Babylonian bricklayers to Viking berserkers, from Egyptian priestesses to Roman emperors, alcohol wasn't an escape from life. It was life fermented, sacred, rowdy, and real. And maybe, just maybe, humanity owes its survival not to sword or scroll, but to the holy, bubbly elixir that kept spirits high and waterborne disease at bay. So next time you lift a glass, raise it not just to the gods, but to the brew mistresses, reed straw suckers, and mead hall poets who drank before you. In history's cup, there's always a little buzz. Booze, bastet, and the business of being remembered. In some cultures, refusing a drink was just rude. In Norse society, it was basically a challenge. A declined cup could end in a duel, or at the very least, a tense silence followed by someone casually sharpening an axe. Norse alcohol wasn't about refinement. It was about symbolism, strength, and surviving long winters. Mead flowed before battle, after victory, during weddings and funerals, sometimes all in the same week. Meanwhile, as the West was perfecting barley bruises and poetic mead hangovers, ancient China was quietly treating alcohol as both art and diplomacy. The Chinese didn't just drink, they choreographed it. Alcohol or Jew ranged from mellow rice beers to grain liquors potent enough to strip paint. By 7000 BCE, while Sumerians were still digging irrigation ditches, the Chinese were brewing proto-cocktails with rice, honey, and fruit. But this wasn't about getting plastered. It was about harmony ritual and impressing the right people without blacking out mid-toast. In Confucian thought, drinking was fine as long as you did it with dignity. One slurred speech at a state banquet, and boom, you're spiritually unbalanced and unemployed. Drinking, especially in courtly settings, was strategic performance. Toasts had to hit the right emotional pitch. Too dry offense. Too drunk, career over. And then, of course, the games. Yes, ancient Chinese banquets came with drinking games, dice riddles, spinning arrows, all designed to determine who drank next. Spoiler, everyone did. Winner drinks. Loser drinks more. It wasn't about winning. It was about surviving the social gauntlet without insulting a duke or vomiting on a poet. Poets, by the way, loved their liquor. Li Bai, the Tang dynasty's poetic rock star, wrote verses while completely hammered and allegedly tried to hug the moon's reflection in a river. He claimed a pot of wine among flowers was enough to unlock the secrets of the universe. Honestly, same. As alcohol evolved from cloudy rice wines to brutal spirits like baijiu, so did its uses. Baijiu, by the way, could clean a wound or cause one depending on your drinking partner. But while some cultures drank to celebrate, others drank to transcend. Enter ancient India and Soma, the drink that may or may not have been a beverage, drug, or religious experience in a cup. Mentioned over 100 times in the Rig Veda, Soma wasn't just drunk, it was worshipped. Sacred, golden, and divinely powerful Soma was filtered through wool mixed with milk and offered to the gods before the priests took a sip and allegedly saw the cosmos unfold. Only the Brahmins and ritual specialists got to drink Soma, turning it into something between spiritual sacrament and psychedelic happy hour. What exactly soma was is still debated. Mushroom plant juice, gone now, maybe extinct. Maybe just hiding in some Himalayan valley, waiting for a very determined botanist and a very weird afternoon. Later texts began speaking of soma metaphorically as a divine nectar, an elixir of life, a mythical hangover cure. Some believe it evolved into Amrita, the drink of immortality in Hindu mythology. Others think it was never about the drink at all, but the state of mind it induced. And across all these ancient civilizations, one pattern repeats: alcohol could build worlds or break them. Take Alexander the Great. Conqueror of half the known world, yes, but also a champion of terrible decisions involving large bowls of unmixed wine. He drank so much at a funeral feast he never recovered. Maybe it was poison, maybe exhaustion. Or maybe you just shouldn't try to outdrink your own army. In ancient China, King Zhou of the Shang dynasty built an actual lake of wine surrounded by meat trees, because why not? Guests drank until they fell in. It was less a party and more a drowning hazard. The dynasty collapsed shortly after. Shocking, really. Then there were the Romans, masters of excess. Caligula added insanity to his wine. Nero cried into his. Commodus drank and brawled in the arena while dressed as Hercules. Public meltdowns became dinner entertainment with fermented grapes as the main culprit. Even the Norse sagas warned against kings who drank too much. Drunkenness dulled honor, made warriors clumsy and rulers unfit to command. Ancient philosophers warned against excess. Confucius preached restraint. Vedic hymns cautioned against spiritual distraction. Even the Greeks, proud wine lovers, drew the line at public staggering. It wasn't the alcohol itself. It was the moment the cup took command. When the drink ruled the king, the kingdom soon followed. But if alcohol could ruin empires, it also reflected what those empires loved. In Egypt, for example, reverence took a furrier form. Dogs in ancient Egypt weren't just pets. They were status symbols, sacred companions, and sometimes divine guides. Pharaohs adored their sleek greyhounds, gave them names like Brave One and North Wind, and buried them with more ceremony than most humans. Some dogs wore collars, had personal attendants, and even received honorary titles. Pet status symbol and minor god, sometimes all at once. And speaking of gods, dogs were linked to Anubis, the jackal-headed deity of embalming and the afterlife. He wasn't just lurking around pyramids. He was a guide protector of souls and a divine escort to the underworld. That connection made dogs sacred by association. Some were even mummified, complete with tiny sarcophagi and painted masks. And it wasn't just the elites. Archaeological finds show working-class Egyptians kept dogs too. Murals from village homes depict scrappy hounds curled under tables or chasing birds in courtyards. Some things never change. 3,000 years ago, people were still sneaking scraps to the dog under the table. The love ran deep. A nobleman named Intef mourned his dog Bekai in a tomb inscription that reads like a tearful eulogy praising his loyalty, hunting prowess, and gentle heart. You can almost picture Intef tipsy on date wine getting misty-eyed over a shared rabbit chase. If dogs had sacred status, cats had straight-up divinity. Worshipped, pampered, and occasionally accessorized cats were seen as magical creatures, mysterious, poised, and deadly efficient at pest control. Their icon, Bastet, the lioness turned house cat goddess of home fertility and protection. At her temples especially, the massive one in Bubastis, people offered food jewelry and, yes, mummified cats. Thousands of them, wrapped like royalty. Some even wore golden earrings. Ancient Egypt had full-on feline fashion culture. Cats were painted into murals lounging under chairs at banquets or cuddled in laps like tiny gods. Harming one even by accident was punishable by death. Seriously, when a Roman soldier killed a cat during the Ptolemaic period, an angry mob tore him apart. No one stepped in, not even the pharaoh. That's how powerful a purr could be. And when cats died, the mourning was epic. Mummified, honored, even buried with their humans. One woman's tomb refers to her cat as my beloved, who walks with me in the field of reeds, a poetic nod to the afterlife. The Romans, ever fans of copying and improving adopted pets as lifestyle. Lapdogs, birds, monkeys, if it could perch, purr, or pose it, found its way into a villa. Wealthy women carried tiny dogs like accessories. Parrots recited Latin insults. Monkeys wore jewelry. Animals weren't just cute, they were curated. Because whether you were toasting ancestors, chugging in a battlefield tent, or sobbing over a mummified kitten, one truth cut across every empire: what you drank and who you loved said everything about who you were. And sometimes the line between sacred ritual and personal chaos was no wider than a spilled cup of wine. Especially during the empire adored tiny companion dogs, often of Eastern origin, likely similar to modern-day Maltese or Paying. These pampered pooches were fed delicacies, adorned with collars of gold, and sometimes even had their own little couches. One famously mourned lapdog whose epitaph survives was praised as more gentle than a dove and a companion who never barked unnecessarily. High praise, especially in a city full of senators. But dogs weren't the only Roman favorites. Exotic birds, particularly parrots and starlings, became fashionable among the elite. These birds were trained to speak sometimes in Greek, sometimes Latin, often both, and were housed in ornate cages. One parrot reportedly greeted guests at banquets with a cheerful "eh," until it tragically died of overexcitement. Its owner held a full funeral, complete with eulogy and floral offerings. Romans, after all, loved spectacle even for birds. Monkeys were another status symbol imported from distant parts of Africa and India. They were considered amusing, if occasionally chaotic, additions to the household. Some were dressed in miniature, to others trained to mimic household staff. They were the original ancient pranksters, cute, clever, and just likely to fling something unpleasant across the atrium. Romans also had a fondness for unusual pets like dormice, which, yes, were sometimes pets and sometimes dinner. Tortoise snakes and even peacocks were kept by those who wanted to display a bit of exotic flair. A senator with a peacock in his garden was signaling both wealth and "look how much I don't care about practicality." But pets weren't just about comfort. They were statements of power, taste, and connection to distant provinces. In a world of conquest and empire, a parrot that could recite Virgil or a dog from Persia wasn't just a companion. It was a flex. In imperial China, pets weren't just playthings. They were portals to harmony, discipline, and beauty. While Western nobles paraded their lapdogs and parrots, Chinese emperors were quietly cultivating living art. Goldfish gliding in porcelain bowls, crickets chirping in carved cages, and dogs that symbolized loyalty, luck, or even cosmic balance. Let's start with goldfish. Not the snack, the spectacle. Originally bred from carp during the Tang Dynasty, goldfish weren't just pretty. They were prized for their color, their form, and their tranquil presence. By the Song Dynasty, emperors and scholars were breeding them selectively, displaying rare varieties in ceramic basins and ornate garden ponds. Watching their graceful movements was a meditative exercise like scrolling through Instagram if Instagram had fins and perfect fune. Then there were crickets. Yes, crickets. Kept in tiny cages made of bamboo or ivory, these little insects weren't just pets. They were musical companions. Their chirping was considered calming, poetic, even spiritual. Song Dynasty poets wrote verses praising the quiet melancholy of cricket song, while children in the Qing era raised them like athletes for chirping contests. Some were even fed better than the household servants. Small lapdogs also held a special place, especially among the aristocracy. Breeds like the Pekin and Shih weren't just cute. They were imperial symbols. Bred to resemble Chinese lions, they were considered sacred, even semi-divine. Legend has it, the Peking descended from lions who shrank themselves out of love for Buddhist monks. Whether true or not, it's one of the few stories where the punchline is adorably fluffy. These imperial dogs were often carried in sleeves, pampered in silk-lined baskets, and guarded by eunuchs, because in the Forbidden City, even your dog had bodyguards. But the Chinese approach to pets wasn't just about cuteness. It was about aesthetic and emotional discipline. A pet's purpose was to cultivate patience, serenity, and connection to nature. To watch a goldfish was to reflect. To listen to a cricket was to appreciate impermanence. To hold a Peking Yeez in your sleeve that was just good taste. In ancient Mesoamerica, pets weren't just cuddly companions. They were spiritual guides, elite status symbols, and sometimes dinner. The line between animal friend and sacred being was blurry. And honestly, that's exactly how the Aztecs, Maya, and other cultures liked it. Let's begin with the Xolotls, quaintly better known today as the Mexican hairless dog. It wasn't bred for its looks, which were, let's say, acquired taste, but for its profound spiritual role. The Xolo was believed to be a psychope, a guide that escorted the souls of the dead to the afterlife. When someone died, it was common for a Xolo to be sacrificed and buried alongside them, ensuring safe passage through the 9 treacherous levels of the underworld. Not exactly the warm, fuzzy goodbye most pet owners hope for, but hey, it was a noble job. These dogs were also kept in homes as companions, guardians, and surprisingly as a food source during ceremonies. Yes, they were both beloved and barbecued. In Mesoamerican logic, something so spiritually significant had to be honored in every way, even gastronomically. Cue the awkward dinner conversation. Then there were jaguar cubs. Among the Maya and the Aztecs, jaguars weren't just apex predators. They were celestial beasts, warriors of the gods, and living embodiment of power. Elite rulers sometimes kept jaguar cubs in palace zoos, not just to flaunt their status, but to commune with divine strength. Imagine walking into a noble's courtyard and seeing a spotted killing machine napping beside a fountain. You wouldn't question his authority or his sanity. Turkeys were also domesticated, but again, they weren't just for the plate. In Maya households, turkeys were seen as sacred messengers, and were sometimes given names and housed indoors. In rituals, they stood in for human sacrifices. A gobble for life trade that the turkey probably didn't appreciate, but historians certainly do. Parrots, too, were adored. Brightly colored makor were kept for their feathers' symbolism and shrieking conversation. Some were trained to mimic speech and used in ceremonies. Others were simply admired living rainbows perched on clay rooftops. The ancient Greeks didn't just value animals for labor or sacrifice. They brought them into their homes, their myths, and occasionally their philosophical debates. While they weren't quite the cat videos crowd, they appreciated the quiet loyalty of dogs, the comic personality of birds, and even the suspiciously clever nature of geese. Yes, geese, we'll get to that. Let's begin with dogs. For Greeks, dogs were not only loyal companions, but also symbols of devotion and protection. The most famous ancient dog might just be Argos Odysseus's old hound, who after 20 years recognizes his master the moment he returns to Ithaca. It's a heartbreakingly loyal moment in Homer's Odyssey, and probably the first recorded "Who's a good boy" in literary history. Guard dogs were common, especially in rural homes. Large, shaggy breeds like the Maloyan hound were prized for their ferocity. Big enough to intimidate intruders, yet tame enough to sleep beside their owners. Greek households didn't need a Ring doorbell. They had 120 lb of growling muscle by the gate. But for those less into slobber, there were birds. The Greeks adored songbirds, especially nightingales and partridges, often kept in delicate cages and taught to mimic melodies. Wealthier households sometimes imported exotic birds from the East, flaunting their wealth one squawk at a time. Aristotle himself wrote about the behaviors of pet birds in his History of Animals, including how some parrots could be taught to say hello and goodbye, before promptly pooping on your scrolls. And now the geese. These honking sentinels weren't just barnyard filler. They were alarm systems. One legend even claims that geese saved the city of Rome. Okay, not Greece, but still close by, honking loudly and alerting the guards to an enemy sneak attack. Greeks, being competitive, likely had equally paranoid geese guarding their temples and granaries. Philosophers also had a soft spot for animals. Diogenes the Cynic, known for living in a barrel and rejecting all social norms, famously admired the simplicity and honesty of dogs, so much so that he embraced the term cynic, derived from the Greek kynikos, meaning dog-like. His companions were often actual strays. The ancient Persians knew a thing or two about elegance, and their pets were no exception. From majestic falcons to the origins of the now iconic Persian cat, animals in Persia weren't just decorations. They were messengers of class spirituality and, surprisingly, tools of soft power. Let's start with the Persians' pride and purr, the Persian cat. While the breed, as we know it today, is a modern refinement, long-haired cats are believed to have originated in the mountainous regions of ancient Persia, modern-day Iran, where their thick coats protected them from the cold. These cats were prized for their beauty, their calm demeanor, and their ability to nap with regal indifference, a trait shared by many emperors. Though not mentioned by name in early Persian records, artistic depictions and artifacts suggest cats were kept in noble households where their grace symbolized refinement and wealth. But Persians didn't just keep cats. They cultivated full-blown menageries. The Achaemenid kings, particularly Darius and Xerxes, kept private zoos filled with exotic animals collected from across their vast empire. Lions, leopards, bears, and rare birds weren't just trophies. They were proof of the empire's reach, hosting foreign ambassadors beside a caged tiger. That's diplomacy with claws. Hunting animals were also central to Persian aristocracy. Falcons, hawks, and cheetahs were trained for the royal sport of hunting, known as baznama. Falconry was not only an elite pastime, but a symbol of discipline and harmony with nature. Training a bird to return to your glove was the ultimate show of patience and prestige. Persian miniatures from the Sassanid era show noblemen with their falcons perched elegantly on their wrists, ready for action, or more likely posing for royal propaganda. Dogs also played a role, especially hunting hounds, which were used to chase gazelles and bow across the rugged terrain. Like their Egyptian and Roman counterparts, these dogs were named cherished, and sometimes even buried with care. What's fascinating about ancient Persian pet culture is its dual nature. These animals were both beloved companions and subtle instruments of image management. A beautiful falcon on your wrist or a majestic lion in your courtyard wasn't just about personal joy. It was a flex, a living, breathing power statement. The Indus Valley civilization, flourishing around 2600–900 BCE, remains one of history's great archaeological mysteries. We can't yet read their script. Their kings remain anonymous, and we still argue over how they fell. But what we do know from toys, bones, and seals is that the people of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had a soft spot for animals, and some of those animals absolutely qualified as pets. Unlike the grandiose pet culture of empires like Rome or Egypt, the Indus Valley vibe was humble, domestic, and surprisingly wholesome. That's the word that comes to mind when archaeologists uncover clay figurines from the Indus Valley, not of snarling beasts or mythic monsters, but of floppy-eared, tail-wagging dogs captured mid-prance or curled in repose. These weren't symbols of conquest or trophies of empire. They were family. Canine remains found nestled close to household sites suggest dogs weren't just tolerated, they were integrated. They guarded doorways, helped herd livestock, and perhaps most importantly, curled up beside their humans at the end of a long day. Even the presence of children's toys, tiny wheeled carts, whistles shaped like animals, and clay dog figures points to a tender reality. These creatures were part of daily domestic life. Not tools, not totems, just companions. And cats, though less omnipresent than in Egypt, still left their paw prints in history. Feline bones scattered around homes suggest they earned their keep hunting rats in the granaries, but their quiet companionship surely earned them a warm spot near the loom or hearth. One can almost picture a Harappan woman weaving while a sleek cat dozed in a patch of sunlight at her feet. But it wasn't the dogs or cats that became the visual icon of the Indus Valley. It was the mighty humped bull. Found on dozens of seals and artifacts, this beast likely held sacred or symbolic meaning, rather than being a pet in the traditional sense. Still, the consistent, reverent portrayal hints at a society that respected animals not just for their utility, but for their presence within a larger cosmic balance. Even elephants may have been semi-domesticated here far earlier than anywhere else, as suggested by their rare but unmistakable depictions in ancient seals. What's perhaps most striking is what the Indus Valley didn't do. There were no pet mausoleums, no gold collars, no funerary statues built for parakeets. Unlike Egypt's elaborate rituals or Rome's theatrical displays, the Indus people didn't seem to flaunt their affection with pageantry. Their love for animals was quiet, utilitarian, and woven into the rhythm of life. A loyal dog, a clever cat, an ox with steady eyes, these weren't ornaments of power. They were colleagues, household members, steady presences in a civilization that valued order and harmony. Superstition was woven into everyday life. If you sneezed, someone would immediately say, "Salve." Not to be polite, but to prevent a soul from escaping your body. Stepping on your own shadow while making a vow was bad luck. Dropping your toga pin on your left side. Watch your back. Augury, the practice of interpreting the behavior of birds, played a crucial role in Roman politics. Aurors, religious officials trained in bird watching, determined whether the gods approved of a decision. Want to declare war or open a new temple, first release the sacred chickens and see if they eat. If they refused their grain, that was a very bad sign. In one notorious case, a Roman commander impatiently threw the chickens overboard when they wouldn't eat. He lost the battle. Naturally, protective household spirits also kept Romans on their toes. Every home had a shrine to the LRUs and Penates, guardian spirits of the household and pantry. Families made regular offerings of food, wine, or incense to keep them happy. Forget to do it, and you risked a run of bad luck, spoiled grain, or something breaking right before dinner guests arrived. Roman brides wore veils not just for fashion, but to hide from jealous spirits. Newborns were given amulets called buller to keep them safe from curses. Even Emperor Augustus reportedly avoided stepping with his left foot. First, a classic Roman superstition tied to omens of failure. In ancient China, superstition was less fringe paranoia and more a daily operating system. It shaped architecture, calendar choices, business deals, and even what direction your bed faced. Harmony with the cosmos was key, but so was avoiding ghosts, bad luck numbers, and whatever might be lurking just outside your ancestral shrine. Let's start with numbers. The Chinese language is full of homophones, which made certain numbers either lucky or cursed. The number 8 Bei, which sounds like FA meaning wealth, was considered extremely lucky. The number 4 Sai, however, sounded dangerously close to the word for death. Because of this, entire buildings were constructed without a 4th floor, and important events were scheduled to avoid that fatal-sounding digit. Ghosts were another daily consideration. Chinese cosmology included a rich world of spirits, some benevolent, some lost and angry. People believed that on certain dates, like the Ghost Festival during the 7th lunar month, the gates of the underworld opened and restless spirits wandered freely. During this time, people burned paper offerings, replica money clothes, even houses to appease the dead and keep them from becoming vengeful freeloaders in the land of the living. But superstition didn't just haunt the calendar. It was built into the architecture. Funyu, literally wind and water, governed the placement of buildings' doors, furniture, and tombs. A poorly positioned home could disrupt cosmic energy and bring illness, failure, or worse, a haunting. Entire cities were laid out according to Funyu principles to keep key life force flowing smoothly and bad energy blocked at the gate. Superstition also guarded newborns. Babies were often given milk names, temporary nicknames, that made them sound unremarkable or even undesirable, like little dog or ugly boy, to trick jealous spirits into ignoring them. Only after surviving infancy would a child be given a real name, often chosen through fortune tellers using birth charts and astrological signs. Protective charms, jade pendants, red strings, and ancestor worship rituals were all part of the daily defense system. Every shrine was a hotline to the deceased, and every act of respect was a spiritual firewall. The Vikings may have been known for sailing, raiding, and wearing fur in impractical ways, but they were also deeply superstitious. The Norse lived in a world where fate wired the gods, and things that went bump in the forest were all taken very seriously. Every tree might house a spirit, every mound might hide a ghost, and every rune carved into a sword might either protect you or doom your descendants. Let's start with runes. More than just a writing system, the runes were believed to carry magical power. A single symbol carved into wood, stone, or bone could bring luck, offer protection, or invoke a curse. Warriors etched runes onto weapons and shields to ensure victory. Farmers carved them into barns and plows for fertile soil. One infamous rune inscription warned, "I have carved these runes for love and for madness." Classic Viking dating strategy. Norse society was also obsessed with fate, which was controlled by the Norns, three mysterious beings who were the destinies of men and gods. Trying to defy fate wasn't just foolish, it was dangerous. Even Odin, the chief god, feared what the Norns had woven for him. To navigate this invisible web, people relied on dreams, omens, and satyr, a mystical form of Norse sorcery, often practiced by women known as vulvers. They offered prophecy, curses, or blessings for a fee. Then came the dead, or more specifically, the dragger. These weren't your polite rest in peace kind of spirits. Draugr were undead warriors, often vengeful, jealous, and horribly smelly. If a man had been particularly greedy or cruel in life, he might rise from his burial mound to harass the living. Preventing this required serious superstition, weapons placed in the grave the wrong way, binding spells, and sometimes even staking the corpse through the chest. Long before Dracula, the Vikings were already taking no chances. And let's not forget trolls, elves, and land vetter, local spirits of the land. Anger them by building in the wrong place, and your farm might catch fire or your cows suddenly stop producing milk. Offerings like bread, milk, or even a bit of beer were left out regularly to keep them appeased. In ancient India, superstition wasn't a fringe belief. It was part of the fabric of everyday life, woven into religion, medicine, architecture, and even grammar. The line between ritual tradition and outright cosmic paranoia was delightfully thin. And if you thought crossing a black cat was bad luck, try living in a world where someone's envious glance could destroy your crops, kill your cow, or give your baby a fever. Let's begin with the dishi dosha, the evil eye, or literally spoiled by a look. The idea that someone's gaze powered by envy or admiration could cause real harm was widely believed. Babies were particularly vulnerable. To protect them, parents would smear a tiny black dot on the child's cheek or forehead to distract or repel the malevolent gaze. Some adults even wore kohl around the eyes, not for fashion, but for energetic shielding. Think eyeliner, but apotropaic. Curses or shrapper were also taken very seriously. The Mahabharata and Ramayana India's epic tales are practically fueled by curses. A rejected sage could curse a king. A spurned goddess could curse an entire dynasty. One wrong word to the wrong rishi, and your next 38 lifetimes were toast. To avoid this, people offered constant respect to holy men and made generous donations just in case they were feeling wrathful that day. But superstition didn't just revolve around fear. It was also about protection and balance. Ancient Indian medicine recognized chakras, energy centers in the body, and used specific rituals, mantras, and even gemstones to heal spiritual or physical imbalance. Wearing a ruby wasn't just flashy. It was believed to strengthen your heart chakra and bring confidence. Emeralds calmed the nerves. Sapphires well handled with care. They were powerful and could backfire if worn incorrectly. Never trust a blue gem without astrological consultation. Superstition shaped daily habits too. It was unlucky to cut your nails on Tuesdays. Sneezing right before leaving the house was a bad omen. Unless you waited a moment and drank water first. Spilling milk meant coming prosperity, while breaking a mirror wasn't feared. But stepping barefoot on spilled rice was serious business. In ancient African cultures, superstition wasn't a side note. It was the headline. Across vast regions from Nubia and Kush to West African kingdoms like N and E, the spiritual world was deeply entwined with the physical. Every illness had a spiritual root. Every misfortune had a cause. And if you didn't understand what the spirits wanted, well, you'd better find a diver. Fast. At the heart of many African superstitions was ancestor reverence. Ancestors weren't just remembered. They were active participants in family life. If crops failed, a child fell ill, or a neighbor gave you a strange look, it wasn't random. It could mean the ancestors were displeased, or that someone had used guju, a form of magical force or sorcery, against you. The remedy consult, a spiritual specialist, offer libations at the family shrine, or wear a protective charm made by someone who knew what they were doing. Speaking of protection, African societies developed elaborate systems of amulets and talismans. In West Africa, these were often called gris, small pouches, filled with herbs, bones, beads, and sometimes written verses worn on the body or tied to doorways. A gris. Gris could protect against evil spirits, curses, or envy. Some were even made specifically to attract love, wealth, or fertility. Basically, a wearable wish list with spiritual Wi-Fi divination also played a major role in navigating the unknown. Systems like, if practiced by the Yoruba, used sacred palm nuts verses and intricate oral traditions to reveal hidden truths. A skilled diver could trace the source of bad luck and prescribe the right offering charm or ritual bath to restore balance. It was therapy, detective work, and divine communication rolled into one. Words held incredible power. A blessing spoken aloud could alter fate. A curse could stick for generations. Names were chosen carefully, often based on the day of birth or events surrounding it. Saying someone's name in anger, especially during a ritual, could trigger spiritual backlash. Silence, when needed, was a protective shield. Superstition in ancient African cultures was never arbitrary. It was a complex system of spiritual accountability. If you lived well, honored your elders, and respected the invisible forces around you, blessings would flow. But ignore a dream, insult a tree spirit, or forget an offering at your grandmother's grave. Then don't be surprised when your goat stops eating your roof leaks and your luck vanishes like morning dew. Across the ancient world, from Babylon's ominous skies to Egypt's gilded amulets, from Chinese funyu to Norse runes carved in panic. Superstition wasn't merely folklore. It was humanity's attempt to impose meaning, order, and protection in a world that often offered none. Crops failed, plagues came, children died, empires collapsed. In the absence of antibiotics or weather forecasts, people turned to the next best thing: charms, curses, rituals, and signs. What's striking is how similar these systems were. Despite oceans and mountains between them, everyone feared the evil eye. Everyone had sacred numbers. Everyone had that one old person in the village who knew which root to burn and what prayer to whisper on a windy night. But ancient superstition wasn't just reactive. It was creative. A way to make the invisible world manageable. You couldn't control an earthquake, but you could bury a protective idol under your doorstep. You couldn't stop death, but you could bind the dead's mouth shut with a cord so they wouldn't rise in vengeance. You couldn't see a virus, but you could hang garlic paint a blue eye or wear an obsidian amulet charged under a blood moon. Superstition also served social functions. It reinforced moral behavior. In India, curses punished disrespect. In Rome, breaking a family ritual could doom your household. In China, failure to honor ancestors might result in your descendants being born under unlucky stars. In a way, superstition was society's spiritual rulebook, equal parts fear, faith, and etiquette. And let's not forget the emotional purpose. Superstition gave people something to do when the unthinkable happened. It offered rituals for grief, practices for protection, and small daily gestures like knocking on wood or whispering charms that gave people a sense of control, however fleeting. Even today, we carry echoes of these beliefs, avoiding certain numbers, wearing lucky clothing, tossing salt over our shoulders. Laugh if you want, but every ancient culture would nod in approval. After all, to them, superstition wasn't ignorance. It was armor. So whether you lit incense for your ancestors, nailed a horseshoe over your door, or spit 3 times to confuse a ghost, you weren't being silly. You were participating in one of humanity's oldest survival strategies, hoping, fearing, and trying to reason with the unseen.